Welcome to Midnight Grove, where stories whisper in the quiet hours of the night. Tonight's tale, The House of Sleeping Books, follows Marion, a traveler who stumbles upon a bookshop she swears wasn't there yesterday. Inside, she finds books that breathe, hum, and wait for the right reader. But when she discovers a book with her own name written inside, she is pulled into a world of forgotten stories, ones she left behind long ago. Some books are never truly lost. Some stories wait patiently to be told, so settle in, listen closely, and let this story remind you of the ones you've yet to finish. Chapter 1. The Bookshop That Wasn't There Yesterday. Marion had been wandering the streets of Saint-Vienne for nearly an hour. The old European town had been her home for only 3 weeks, but already she had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Morning coffee at the corner cafe, afternoons spent sketching in the park, and long, aimless evening walks before heading back to her small rented flat. Tonight, however, the streets felt different. Not unsettling, not eerie, just new, which was strange, because she had walked this route a dozen times before. And yet, somehow, the bookshop in front of her had never been there yesterday. A bookshop that only opened at night. It had no sign above the door, no bright window displays, just a single golden light glowing from within, flickering gently against the glass. A chalkboard stood just outside, its elegant script barely illuminated in the dim alleyway. The House of Sleeping Books. Open from dusk until dawn. Marion hesitated. She wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere. And something about the bookshop, the way it seemed tucked away from time itself, made her curious. Before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped inside. And the moment she did, the world outside faded away. The smell of forgotten stories. A bell chimed softly as the door shut behind her. The air inside was warm, filled with the scent of aged paper, ink, and something faintly floral, like pressed lavender between pages. The bookshop was larger than it looked from the outside. Rows upon rows of tall wooden bookshelves stretched toward the ceiling, each one overflowing with old leather-bound volumes, delicate paperbacks, and books with no visible titles. Candles flickered in ornate brass holders. A spiral staircase led to an upper level, where even more bookshelves curved along the balcony. And perhaps strangest of all, some of the books on the shelves were breathing. Books that dream. Marion's breath caught. The books weren't moving in any dramatic way. No fluttering pages, no floating in mid-air. But they were alive. Their covers rose and fell as if taking slow, steady breaths. Some hummed so faintly it was almost imperceptible, like a whisper of a dream. It wasn't unsettling. It was calming, like stepping into a place where time itself had slowed. "Bienvenue," a voice murmured. Marion turned. Behind the counter stood a bookseller, an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with silver-threaded hair and a dark vest over a crisp white shirt. His expression was unreadable, though his eyes, a warm, knowing brown, studied her with quiet curiosity. "You are welcome to look," he said in lightly accented English. "The books here wait for the right reader." Marion hesitated. "What does that mean?" The bookseller simply smiled. "You will see." The book that knew her name. Marion wandered the aisles, fingertips brushing the worn spines. Some books had titles etched in gold, others bore no markings at all. And then she saw it. A book that was already open, sitting on a velvet cushion, its pages glowing faintly in the candlelight. Drawn by something she couldn't explain, Marion stepped closer, and her breath caught, because at the top of the open page, written in delicate looping script, was a name. Her name. Marion Evelyn Carter. Her pulse quickened. She looked around, half expecting someone to explain, to tell her this was a mistake. But no one did. The book had been waiting for her. And slowly, carefully, she reached out and turned the page. And the moment she did, she wasn't in the bookshop anymore. A story she had forgotten. The world around her shifted. 1 second, she was standing in the warm glow of the bookshop. The next, she was somewhere else. Somewhere familiar. A cobblestone street, the smell of summer rain, the distant hum of a city settling into evening, and at the center of it all, a little girl. Marion's breath hitched. She knew this street. She knew this moment, because the little girl sitting on the steps, flipping through a worn picture book, was her, at 7 years old, the first book she ever loved. Marion watched in stunned silence as her younger self traced the illustrations with tiny fingers, completely lost in the story. She remembered this day. She remembered the book, an old second-hand collection of fairy tales her mother had given her. She had read it over and over again until the pages were soft and frayed, until she could recite the stories by heart. She had believed for the longest time that stories held real magic, that they could transport you, change you, shape the way you saw the world. And yet, she had forgotten. At some point, between growing up and growing tired, she had let go of that feeling. She had stopped believing in magic, stopped believing in stories that waited for the right reader. Until now, until tonight. A book that remembered. The world shifted again. Marion blinked, and she was back in the bookshop. The book was still open in front of her, and for the first time in years, she felt something bloom inside her chest. Something she thought she had lost. The bookseller stepped beside her, his voice gentle. "The books here do not tell new stories," he murmured. "They remind you of the ones you left behind." Marion let out a slow breath. Her fingers traced the gold lettering on the book's cover. It had no title, because the title was hers. Her story, waiting for her to remember. And tonight, she finally had. Chapter 2. The Story That Was Never Finished. Marion sat motionless, staring at the open book in front of her. Her name was written on the page, in the same delicate script she had seen before. But now there was more. Below her name, a passage had begun to appear on its own, words forming in smooth, curling ink, as if the book was writing itself. A forgotten chapter. Marion watched as the letters took shape. At first she thought it was simply a memory, describing the moment she had just experienced, the day she first fell in love with books as a child. But then, the words kept going, telling a story she didn't quite recognize. There was once a girl who believed that stories could be anything. doors, windows, even wings. She would sit for hours, lost in the pages, believing in magic without question. But one day, she stopped believing, and the stories waited, patient and quiet, for her to return. Marion's pulse quickened. She traced her fingers along the ink. It was smooth, not printed, not typed. It had been written for her. "Is this—" she hesitated, looking up at the bookseller. "Is this my life?" The bookseller's warm, knowing eyes met hers. "Not all of it," he said softly. "Only the part you left unfinished. The unwritten pages." Marion stared at the book, her thoughts tangled. It was true, wasn't it? She had been that child, the one who carried a book everywhere, who stayed up late under the covers with a flashlight, devouring stories as if they were oxygen. She had written stories too once, filling notebooks with half-formed ideas, sketches of characters she was certain would live forever. And then she had stopped. Not all at once, not with a grand dramatic decision, but gradually, as life pulled her in different directions. Deadlines replaced daydreams, emails replaced stories. She still read, of course, but it was different now, something quiet, something passive. The belief she had once carried, the certainty that stories were more than just words, had faded. And now, sitting in this impossible bookshop, it was as if the books had been waiting for her to notice. The library of lost stories. The bookseller motioned for her to follow him. Still dazed, Marion stood, leaving the open book behind as she trailed him through the winding aisles. They walked deeper into the shop, past shelves filled with untitled books, their spines worn smooth. She whispered, "What are these?" "These are the stories left unfinished," the bookseller replied. "Stories that were meant to be written but never were. Dreams never followed, ideas never given form." Marion swallowed. "They're blank?" The bookseller stopped at one of the shelves. He reached for a book at random, a thick leather-bound volume with no markings. Opening it, he turned the pages toward her. They weren't blank. They were waiting. Sentences began appearing as soon as she looked at them. Faint, unfinished paragraphs, half-written thoughts. Marion felt a chill run through her. "They change," she murmured. "They do," the bookseller agreed. "Because stories don't truly disappear. They linger, waiting for someone to bring them to life." The chapter she never wrote. Marion couldn't look away. Her mind reeled with 1,000 questions. Were these all stories from forgotten authors, or were they— She hesitated. "Do I have a book here?" The bookseller smiled. Instead of answering, he led her further into the bookshop, toward a small alcove tucked between towering shelves. A single book sat on a pedestal, bathed in the glow of a flickering candle. It was thin, smaller than the others, but unmistakably hers. Marion stepped forward, heart pounding. She ran her fingers over the cover. It had no title, no author, just a waiting presence. She swallowed hard and opened it. And there on the very first page she saw it. A story she had started writing 16 years ago. A story she had forgotten. But the book hadn't. The choice. Marion's breath hitched. She knew this story. She had written it as a teenager, scribbled in the margins of school notebooks, drafted late at night when she should have been sleeping. It had been the beginning of something. but she had never finished it. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. Some were filled, others were incomplete. And then, near the end, blank pages, waiting. Marion's throat tightened. "This is impossible," she whispered. The bookseller gave her a long, measured look. "No," he said gently. "This is a second chance." Marion swallowed hard. The candlelight flickered against the page, casting shadows like letters waiting to be written. And suddenly, she knew. She knew why she had come here, why the bookshop had appeared tonight after all these years. This wasn't just about reading. This was about remembering who she used to be, and deciding the once and for all if she was ready to begin again. She let out a slow breath. Then, for the first time in 16 years, she picked up a pen and she started to write. Chapter 3, The Story That Was Waiting. The ink on the page shimmered faintly under the candlelight. Marion's hand hovered over the open book, her fingers curled around the weight of the pen. She had written exactly 4 words. Once upon a time. And then she had stopped. The fear of beginning. She hadn't expected it to be so hard. After all, she had written stories before. As a child, she had filled notebook after notebook, crafting worlds, dreaming up characters who felt as real as the people in her life. But now the words felt fragile. She had spent so long believing her stories didn't matter, telling herself that life had more practical things to focus on: bills, schedules, responsibilities. What if she tried to write again and failed? What if she had lost whatever magic she once had? A soft rustle broke the silence. She turned. The bookseller was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Something is stopping you," he observed. Marion let out a slow, unsteady breath. "I don't know how to do this anymore," she admitted. "I don't even know if I ever really could." The bookseller tilted his head slightly. "You did once." Marion looked down at the unfinished pages, frustration curling in her chest. "That was a long time ago." The bookseller studied her carefully. Then, in a quiet voice, he asked, "Tell me, Marion, why did you stop?" The moment she stopped believing, Marion's fingers tightened around the pen. She had told herself the reasons over the years. Life got busy, she grew up. Writing wasn't practical, but those were half-truths. The real reason, the moment she had stopped believing in her own words, was a memory she had buried for years. And now, as if the bookshop itself had been waiting for her to admit it, the memory rose to the surface. She was 16 years old, sitting in a cold classroom, clutching a printed copy of the first story she had ever dared to share, a story she had written late at night, poured her heart into, and it had landed in the hands of someone who didn't understand it. A teacher, someone she had admired, someone who had read it and sighed, shaking their head. "Marion, writing is a nice hobby, but maybe focus on something more practical, something real. A single moment. A few careless words, and just like that, she had stopped writing, stopped dreaming, stopped believing that her words were worth anything at all, a story that deserved to be told. Marion's throat tightened. That moment had shaped everything. But now, sitting here in a place where books breathed, where unfinished stories waited patiently for their authors to return, she realized something. That teacher's words had never been the truth. The truth was in the stories she had loved, the ones she had filled pages with as a child, the ones she had never forgotten. And most of all, the one sitting in front of her now, waiting. The bookseller didn't speak. He simply watched as Marion lifted the pen, and this time she wrote. The words finally come. At first the sentences felt awkward, uneven, stilted, but then something shifted. The hesitation fell away, and the words poured out. Her story unfolded, slowly at first, then faster. A story she had begun as a teenager and had abandoned out of fear. But now, in the quiet glow of the bookshop, with the shelves whispering around her, she found her voice again. She wrote about a girl who had once believed in magic, who had lost her way but never truly forgotten, who had finally come back, realizing that some stories never leave us. They wait. The house of sleeping books. Hours passed. Maybe longer. Marion didn't know, and for the first time in years, she didn't care. The book filled with her words, the empty pages disappearing, replaced by something real. By the time she lifted her head, the candle beside her had nearly burned out. The bookseller gave her a small, satisfied smile. "You see," he murmured, "it was never gone." Marion exhaled slowly, heart still racing. She hadn't finished the story. Not yet. But she had begun, and that was enough. The final question. As she closed the book, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. But then, the bookseller asked one final question. "Will you take it with you?" Marion hesitated. She looked down at the book, the story that had waited for her for so long. She could leave it here in the quiet warmth of the shop. Or she could take it with her, take it into the real world, into a life where stories weren't always magical, where people could be dismissive, where fear could creep in. But then she thought of her younger self, the girl who had believed in stories, the girl who had been told to stop dreaming, the girl who had never truly stopped at all. Marion reached for the book, and she took it. A door that only opens once. The bookseller smiled, as if he had known all along what she would choose. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the front of the shop. Marion walked slowly, the book clutched to her chest. She paused at the door. Somehow she knew this was a bookshop you could only find once. Once you left, it wouldn't be there when you returned. The stories inside would sleep again, waiting for the next lost dreamer to come searching. She turned back to the bookseller. "Will I ever see this place again?" she asked. His smile was quiet. "Perhaps, but you won't need to." Marion nodded. And then she stepped outside. The door closed behind her, and when she turned around, the bookshop was gone. A story that finally had an ending. Marion stood in the empty alleyway, the morning light just beginning to creep across the cobblestones. In her hands the book was warm, real, and inside The first chapter of a story that had waited far too long to be written. She took a deep breath. And then she walked forward, back into the world, back into her life, with a story she would finally finish. Thank you for joining us at Midnight Grove for the House of Sleeping Books. Marion's story is one we all share, a story of dreams we set aside, words we were afraid to write, and memories that wait patiently for us to return. As you drift into sleep, may you remember the stories you once loved, the ones that shaped you and the ones that are still waiting inside you. Sleep well, and we'll see you next time for another journey into the quiet magic of storytelling.